There is a door in the building where I used to work that I never once saw open. Not locked, not sealed, not blocked by furniture or obscured behind anything that would have made it inaccessible. It was simply a door in a hallway on the lower level of the building, with an ordinary handle and an ordinary frame. And in 11 years of working in that building, I opened every door on every level for every conceivable professional reason, and I never opened that one. Nobody did. Nobody I ever worked with in 11 years at Carver and Sons Funeral Home in southwestern Virginia ever touched that door. Not because we had been told not to. Not because of any policy or prohibition that anyone had communicated to me or to anyone else on the staff. Because in the way that certain things in certain places develop a kind of gravity around them, an unspoken agreement that this thing is not approached, this door is not opened, this question is not asked directly, nobody went near that door. I thought about that for years before I understood why. I understood why on the last night I ever worked there. My name is Leonard Cross. I was a licensed mortician and the senior preparation specialist at Carver and Sons for 11 years, from 2009 to 2020. I am 44 years old now. I have not worked in funeral service since I walked out of that building on a cold February night and sat in my car in the empty parking lot for 2 hours before I trusted myself to drive. I have not spoken about this publicly before. I have not spoken about it privately, except to my wife, who listened to everything and said nothing for a long time, and then said, "You have to tell someone who can carry it better than you are carrying it alone." She was right. She usually is. I need to tell you about the building before I tell you about what the building did. Because what the building did cannot be separated from what the building was. They are the same thing. The building's history and the building's behavior are not two topics. They are one topic. And you cannot understand the second without the first. Carver and Sons was established in 1931 by a man named Elias Carver in a building that was already old when he purchased it. The structure dated to approximately 1878. It had lived several lives before Elias Carver converted it to funeral use. It had been a private residence, then a boarding house. And for approximately 12 years in the early 20th century, it had operated as a small private hospital. Not a general hospital in the modern sense. A recovery facility. A place where patients who had undergone surgery came to convalesce for extended periods, in the era before modern medical infrastructure made such facilities unnecessary. Patients would stay for weeks, sometimes months. Some of them recovered. Some of them did not. The architectural evidence of the hospital period was still present in the building if you knew what you were looking at. The width of certain door frames, designed to accommodate wheeled equipment. The configuration of the ventilation in the lower level rooms, engineered for a use that required more air circulation than ordinary residential construction. The placement and number of electrical outlets in what was now our preparation area. Far more than any private residence would have required. Consistent with a room that had once needed to power medical equipment continuously. The bones of the building's previous life were still there, visible to anyone who looked closely enough and knew what they were seeing. Elias Carver had bought it in 1931, and his family had operated it as a funeral home for 3 generations. By the time I arrived in 2009, William Carver, the 3rd generation, a quiet and exacting man who had inherited the business from his father, was running the operation. William knew that building the way you know something you were born inside of. Not as a place you have learned, but as an extension of yourself. Something so thoroughly familiar that it no longer exists as a separate object in your experience, but has become part of your own interior geography. He knew its sounds and its temperatures, and the way light moved through it at different hours, and the particular ways it behaved in different seasons. He also knew things about the building that he did not share easily or directly, and that I came to understand only gradually, over years, the way you come to understand the unspoken grammar of any institution you inhabit long enough. You watch, you listen, you note the things that are not said, and develop over time a map of what is avoided and begin to understand, from the shape of the avoidance, what lies at the center of it. What lay at the center of it was the building itself. The first thing I noticed was the names. I want to say this carefully because it is the kind of thing that sounds like nothing when it is described in isolation and that accumulates significance only across years, only in the context of enough instances that the alternative explanations become mathematically untenable. What happened was this. I was in the lower level hallway on a morning in my first month at Carver & Sons. I was preparing to enter the preparation room for the day's first case. I had my intake documentation on a clipboard that I had carried down from the office without opening. It was my habit to review the documentation in the hallway outside the preparation room before entering. A few minutes of deliberate preparation before beginning the work, a practice I had developed in my years before Carver & Sons and brought with me. On that particular morning, before I opened the clipboard, before I saw the name on the intake form, I heard something in the air of the hallway. Not a voice. I want to be specific about this distinction, because it matters enormously for what I am describing. It was not the sound of a voice saying a word. It was a word present in the air, in the way that a word is present in the moments immediately after it has been spoken. The way the quality of a room holds what has just been said for a fraction of a second after the sound has ended. The word was a name. Gerald. Present in the hallway air without anyone having said it, without any mechanical or acoustic source I could identify, simply there. I opened the clipboard. The intake form for the morning's case was for a man named Gerald Whitmore, 74 years old, cardiac arrest. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I told myself that I'd seen the name on the intake rack upstairs before I consciously registered it, and that my subconscious had processed and retained it and surfaced it through some mechanism I could not fully account for. It was a plausible enough explanation. I filed it under the things that do not require further investigation, and I went into the preparation room and I did my work. The second time it happened, I had been deliberate about not seeing the name before descending. I had carried the closed file downstairs specifically because the first time was sitting at the back of my attention in the way unresolved things sit, and I had wanted to test the variable cleanly. I walked down to the lower level with a file I had not opened, and in the hallway outside the preparation room, the name was in the air before I looked at the form. Margaret. The case was a woman named Margaret Ellis, 67 years old, stroke. The third time I knew it was not coincidence. And the fourth time I stopped looking for an explanation, and the fifth time I understood that I was not going to find one. And the sixth time I accepted what I had. Over 11 years at Carver & Sons, I heard the name of the person who had come to rest in the lower level before I consciously learned it more times than I could accurately count. Not every single time. It was not mechanical or consistent in the way of a system. Some mornings the hallway was simply a hallway, and the air held nothing but the cool, ambient temperature of the lower level and the faint background smell of the work. But across 11 years it happened with enough frequency and enough clarity that I had long since stopped trying to account for it through any framework that did not include the building itself as the source. The building knew the names. It kept them. It held them in the air of the lower level, of the way old stone walls hold cold, not actively, not deliberately, in the way a person is deliberate, but as a property of what the walls were and what they had absorbed across the decades. Since 1931, and since before 1931. Since the years when this building had been a place where people came when they were close to the end, and some of them did not leave. The building had been receiving names, and somewhere in the accumulation of that, somewhere in the specific way that certain old structures develop a relationship with what has happened inside them, it had learned to hold them. This was the first thing. The thing that ran beneath everything else. The thing I understood earliest and accepted most slowly. The second thing was the cold. There was a fixed cold spot in the lower level hallway at a location approximately 6 feet from the door. I've told you I never opened. This was not the general cool of the lower level, which was consistent with the age and depth of the space and the limitations of the climate control in an old building, and which your body adjusted to within minutes of descending. This was a localized cold, a specific zone of perhaps 4 feet in diameter, where the temperature was measurably and dramatically lower than the surrounding air. I measured it in my second year with a digital thermometer I used for other purposes. 68 degrees in the hallway, 51 degrees at the cold spot, 17 degrees of difference with no duct or vent or mechanical source of any kind in the vicinity. I documented the readings carefully, which is my nature. I am a methodical person, and documentation is both a professional habit and a personal one. I kept a log of temperature readings at the cold spot across a period of 8 months. The readings varied slightly, the way any temperature reading varies with the seasons and the ambient conditions of the building, but the differential held consistently between 15 and 19 degrees below the surrounding hallway air. There was nothing in the building's mechanical or architectural records that accounted for it. The HVAC contractor, who came to inspect the lower level in my third year, found nothing that explained it, and noted in his report that the cold spot was, from a mechanical standpoint, unexplained. I showed the documentation to William Carver. He looked at it for a measured moment. Then he said, in a tone that held the specific quality of a man confirming something he already knows, "My father measured it too. He got similar readings." "What causes it?" I asked. William considered his answer with the care he brought to everything. "The building has been holding the dead for a long time," he said. "Longer than most people know. Some places, when they hold enough of something for long enough, develop properties, things that don't have clean explanations." He looked at the documentation in my hand. "The cold has been there as long as anyone in my family can remember. My grandfather noted it. My father noted it. Now you've noted it." He paused. "I've always understood it as the building doing something, not malfunctioning, doing something." I asked him what it was doing. He did not answer that question directly. He said only that he thought the lower level was a more active part of the building than the floors above, and that by active, he meant something he was not sure he had the right vocabulary for, and that he had found over the years that the lower level rewarded attention and did not respond well to dismissal. I carried that conversation for years. The third element of the building's character was the hardest to describe because it had no discrete event attached to it, no temperature reading, no name in the air, nothing I could document in a log. It was a quality of the lower level when I was alone in it. A sense of accompaniment that was as consistent and as unremarkable after the first year as the temperature or the sound of the ventilation. When I was alone in the lower level, I was not in some quality of experience that I cannot reduce to a mechanism, alone. Something was in the space with me, not attending to me, not watching or following or directed at me in any particular way. Simply present, co-occupying the space, the way another person's presence registers in a room even when they are not paying attention to you. The background awareness of shared occupancy. I made my accommodation with this. I had no alternative. The work required the lower level, and the work was what I was there for. And after the first year, the sense of accompaniment had become simply part of the texture of the environment, as unremarkable as the cold spot or the occasional name in the air. I worked in it and around it, and I did not discuss it with the other staff. 2 younger morticians who came and went across my 11 years, neither of whom seemed to have developed the sensitivity to the building's qualities that I had, or if they had, said nothing about it. I said nothing either. The grammar of Carver and Sons did not invite that conversation. William Carver had made his accommodation long before I arrived, and he maintained it with the practiced silence of a third-generation family member who has lived inside a particular truth for so long that the truth no longer requires discussion. What I'm going to tell you now is about the night of February the 19th, 2020. This is the night that I have thought about every day since. The night when everything that had been background for 11 years became foreground, and when the building showed me what it had been building toward. I was alone in the building. This was not unusual. I worked late frequently, and I worked alone frequently, and the empty building at night was as familiar to me as my own house. I was completing the preparation of a woman named Frances Delacroix, 81 years old, who had died of natural causes 4 days earlier, and whose funeral service was scheduled for the following morning. The preparation was going well. Frances had lived a full life and died in the expected way, and the work had the quality of good, uncomplicated craft. Straightforward, careful, dignified. I had been in the preparation room for approximately 90 minutes when I became aware that something had changed in the lower level. Not a sound, not a visual change. A change in the quality of the space, the way the space felt occupied. But different from the ordinary accompaniment I was used to. More concentrated, more present, like the difference between a room where someone is in the background and a room where someone has stepped forward. I continued working. I was 3/4 of the way through the preparation, and the work was at a stage that required sustained attention, and I gave it that attention. But the change in the room was building. The way pressure builds, not uncomfortably, but unmistakably, in the way of something that has been moving toward a point and is getting close to it. I was completing the final stages of the facial preparation when the cold moved. In 11 years, the cold spot had occupied a single fixed location in the hallway. It had never, in 11 years, been anywhere other than that fixed point 6 feet from the door. I would have said with complete certainty that it was a property of that specific location. Something in the structure of the building at that point. Something in the relationship between the stone and the air at that particular spot. On the night of February the 19th, it was in the preparation room with me. I understood this before I could have explained how I understood it. The same way I understood the names, through a quality of perception that the 11 years had developed in me. A sensitivity to the building's particular language that had built slowly and was now, in this moment, receiving a transmission it had never received before. The cold was in the room, moving through it, slowly, with the quality of deliberateness, not the random drift of a temperature differential, but something oriented, something with a direction. It was moving toward the table where Frances Delacroix was lying. I put down my instruments. I stood at the table and I watched. The air above the table shimmered slightly, in the way that air shimmers when extreme cold moves through warmth. The slight visual distortion of a temperature differential made visible. The cold reached the table. I felt it on my hands, on my face, the specific cold of the hallway cold spot, 17 degrees below the room's ambient temperature, localized and precise. It held there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then it resolved. The shimmer in the air smoothed. The cold receded completely and did not return to its fixed location in the hallway. It simply ended, the way a sound ends when the source of it stops. The sense of concentrated presence that had been building for 90 minutes was gone. The room was ordinary again. The accompaniment that was the lower level's constant quality was gone too. Not diminished, but completely absent, leaving a silence that was more complete than any I had experienced in 11 years in that building. I stood at the table for a long time. Then I walked out of the preparation room and down the hallway to the door. I want to tell you I understood what I was doing when I walked to that door. I did not. What I understood was that the sequence of the night, the changed quality, the moved cold, the resolution, the complete cessation of everything the building had been doing for 11 years, had arrived at a completion that included that door, that the night was not finished, that whatever had been happening in the lower level of Carver and Sons for 11 years had been moving toward this moment and this door, and was waiting for me to understand that. I put my hand on the handle. I turned it. The door opened without resistance, which I had somehow expected, because the door had never been locked, only unapproached, and the approaching was what had been waiting. Behind the door was a small room, stone walls, the oldest part of the building, the original structure from 1878. Cold, not the localized cold of the cold spot, but the pervasive cold of a space that has been sealed for a very long time and has taken on the temperature of the stone around it. Empty except for one thing. On the far wall, mounted to the stone, was a large wooden board. Old, very old. The wood nearly black with age and the particular darkness of something that has been in an enclosed space for decades. And on the board, filling it from edge to edge in columns arranged by year, written in inks that ranged from fresh black to the pale sepia of something a century old, were names. I stepped closer to read them. The oldest entries at the top of the board were dated to the 1880s and 1890s, names in handwriting that belonged to the hospital period, the names of patients who had come to this building to recover and had not recovered, dozens of them across the hospital years. Then a gap where the building had sat between its lives, and then beginning in 1931, in a different hand, the names from the funeral home period. Hundreds of them. The entire history of the dead who had passed through the lower level of Carver and Sons, recorded in the handwriting of a dozen different people across more than a century, maintained by someone and then someone else and then someone else, in the understanding that the names needed to be kept, that someone needed to keep them. I stood in that cold room for a very long time, reading names. Some of them I recognized from my 11 years. I stood in that small, cold room with the board of names, and I understood. In the way you understand, when asked things that do not arrive through reasoning, but through an accumulated weight of evidence, finally tipping past the threshold of uncertainty. What the building had been doing, not just in my 11 years, but across all of its years, since the first patients had come to convalesce in 1878, and some of them had not left. The building had been keeping the record. The cold spot and the names in the air and the sense of accompaniment had not been separate phenomena. They had been aspects of a single thing. The building's memory, the building's insistence that the dead who had passed through it were not simply gone, that their names at minimum, the fact of them at minimum, needed to be held somewhere, kept by something. And on the night of February the 19th, with Frances Delacroix on the table and the preparation nearly complete, and the cold spot moved for the first time in 11 years to her table, the building had let me see how it was done. I went back to the preparation room. I completed Frances Delacroix's preparation. Every remaining stage, with my full attention and my full care, because she deserved it, and because whatever had kept her name for a century in that building before she was ever born into it, whatever kept the names of all of them, in columns of ink on black wood behind a door nobody opened, it deserved to know that the person who did this work understood now what the work was part of. I resigned the following Monday. I told William I was leaving. He looked at me the way he had looked at the temperature readings, the look of someone confirming what they already know. He asked if I had gone in the room. I told him yes. He nodded slowly. He said, "My father went in the room when he was ready. His father before him." He looked at me steadily. "It shows you when you've been here long enough." I asked him about Frances Delacroix's name, how it had gotten on the board. He was quiet for a long time. "I don't know how it gets there," he said. "I only know that it does, that it always has. The names are there before I write them, and sometimes when I go to add a name, it's already there." He looked at the surface of his desk. My grandfather kept a record of the ones that appeared on their own. He stopped keeping the record after a few years because the record was redundant. They were always right. I left Carver and Sons on a Friday. I think about that building every day. I think about the cold room and the board and the columns of ink in a dozen different hands going back to the 1880s. I think about what it means that a building can accumulate something, a memory, a record, a presence, across a century and a half of holding the dead. I think about the cold spot moving on the night of February the 19th and reaching the table where Frances Delacroix lay, and resolving there, completing there, doing whatever it went there to do. I think about what it was doing. I think it was saying the name, the way it always had, in the air of the hallway before anyone opened the file. Saying the name because the name was all it had to offer. Because names are what the dead leave behind that lasts the longest. And keeping them is the only service available to whatever a building becomes when it has held enough of us for long enough. I think about the door. It is still there. The board is still there. The cold spot is back in its fixed position, if I had to guess, 6 feet from the door in the lower level hallway. The names are still being added, by William, or by the building itself, or by some collaboration between the two that I am not certain anyone has fully understood. And every morning, when whoever now works the lower level of Carver and Sons descends to begin the day, I am almost certain that the name of the person waiting in the preparation room is in the air of the hallway, said by something old and patient and keeping a record that goes back further than anyone can remember, still holding the names as it always has.